All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Tuesday. Tuesday. Welcome to Tuesday. Yeah, welcome to Tuesday. That's all I have to say to you. So Kayla's here. Good morning, Kayla. Arya and Aryan are here. Good morning to you guys. Let's jump in and start. So we're kind of finding our way into classical Greece here. And yesterday we were talking about how Athens becomes a documentary, how Athens becomes a democracy, because that's different. It's kind of an interesting story, and again, it's so strange for the ancient world, right? No other city-states really operate like this, and arguably no other place in the world operates like this. And so it's a very kind of unique political system, but of course, one that's very significant for Western culture because we are a democracy. And I would argue that we are a democracy because of ancient Greece. So because of what those people did in Athens 2,500 years ago, that had a real effect in terms of who we are and what we value here in the West. So we're kind of coming into the classical period here, like I mentioned. I mentioned that probably the two most important polises or polis or city-states in this period are Athens and Sparta, two completely different places that we'll hear a little bit about shortly. So I said that Athens and Sparta are kind of down in the southern part of Greece there. Athens up there, and then on the Peloponnese you have Sparta just across a little land bridge there. Yesterday we read this section of the textbook, and you told me a few important things, right? You said that a tyrant was a leader who kind of seized power, sometimes illegally or illegitimately, and then they kind of ruled, right? And again, the original kind of definition of tyrant isn't the cruel, oppressive leader, but it takes on that connotation, especially with the sons of one of Athens' tyrants, Hippias and Hipparchus, right? So we heard about Pisistratus, who gains power in Athens, even though by this time Athens has somewhat of a democracy happening, right? So we've had those reforms by Solon, who created some democratic elements in Athens, but then Pisistratus came in and basically ruled like a king. But he seems to have done a good job. People seem to have been happy with what he did, and so he was kind of allowed to stay in power for, as you can see, about 40 years or so. But after he dies, his sons become rulers after him, and they're both kind of awful, right? And so I think, if I remember, Hippias is assassinated. There's two Greeks who get together and kill Hippias. Hipparchus then comes into power, and the Athenians kind of call the Spartans and ask for help, and the Spartans show up and help drive the tyrant out of Athens. Okay. So after they're kicked out, of course, there's kind of a question of, what are we going to do, right? What kind of government is this city-state going to have? And it kind of falls to this guy Cleisthenes to figure it out. And Cleisthenes, these ancient Greek names, Cleisthenes is a Athenian nobleman. Okay, so he comes from a prominent family, comes from an aristocratic family, and he actually was expelled from Athens by, I think, Hippias. But they bring him back and they say, Cleisthenes, help us out, help us draft a new constitution, a new way of operating for Athens. And so Cleisthenes is kind of stuck because he knows that the two ways that people normally go about ruling city-states aren't going to work for Athens, right? Either you give power to a single ruler, right? And then you're constantly at the mercy of whether this ruler is good, right? If you get a Pisistratus, great, everything's fine. If you get a Hippias or a Hipparchus, everything is awful, right? So this isn't a really good political system because you never really know who you're going to get, right? And once you get them, you can't get rid of them. On the other hand, you could just allow aristocrats to kind of influence and rule the city-state, but the aristocrats are constantly fighting with each other, and they're trying to gain more control over each other. And sometimes you have little civil wars breaking out, and that's no good either, right? It's a recipe for instability and assassinations and intrigue, right? So that doesn't work either. Plus, by this point, the Athenians are not too interested in having a single leader, right? So having Hippias and then Hipparchus, they kind of don't like the idea of having a single leader anymore. They had one, it left a bad taste in their mouth. They want something else. And so Cleisthenes does something that's kind of very revolutionary, but also very in keeping with the sort of mood of Athens and the ancient Greek world, right? And I won't kind of go through all of these because we need a little more background to really understand them. But there is this feeling of personal empowerment, okay? So if you read the sort of the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are supposed to be written by a guy named Homer, if you read those, you'll see that heroes are the aristocrats, right? Heroes are the demigods or the gods. But over time, people start to see the ability to be great in all sorts of fields, right? And the Olympic Games is a good symbol of that because you can go and win at the Olympics, right, in whatever event you compete in, and it doesn't really matter who you are, right? It doesn't matter if you're a king or an aristocrat or a commoner or a merchant. It doesn't matter if you're from Athens or Corinth or if you're from some nowhere town in sort of backwater Greece. It doesn't matter where you're from or who you are or what your last name is or what your position in society is. If you go there and you win, you're the winner, right? You're a hero. It doesn't matter where you come from. And so people are increasingly seeing themselves as capable of being heroes, right? Capable of being heroes of their own story, right? And so in kind of combination with that idea, in combination with the Athenians not wanting another single leader, in sort of combination with seeing these two political systems, monarchy and oligarchy, and neither of them really work very well, Cleisthenes has a bit of an epiphany, and he's like, we're going to give power to the people, right? We're going to let people vote on things, right? Decisions will be made by everybody, right? And so, as you can see, let me just actually, let me just pull it up here. There it is. And what page were we on the other day? Sorry, I had this all ready to show you yesterday. 190, okay. There it is. So basically what Cleisthenes comes up with, and then is kind of elaborated on, is this, right? And this looks incredibly complicated, and to some degree it is, but this is the Greek political system. And we'll learn a little bit more about the major parts of it, but what's really interesting about it is that it is very similar to how countries like Canada and the US work today. And the details are different, right? Because the ancient Athenians would vote on everything, right? Every question that came up, everybody would vote on. Here in Canada, we don't do that, right? We have an election, and then we send a representative to Ottawa, and then they vote for us on everything, right? So we have a representative democracy. The Athenians had a direct democracy. But if you look, there are three important parts of this political system. There's an executive branch, so a part of the government that kind of runs the state, right, and takes care of the day-to-day business. There's a legislative part, a part of the government or a part of the political system that makes laws, makes and passes laws. And then there's a judicial component, right, a section of it that tries crimes, right, and punishes people. And here you can see exactly the same thing happening in ancient Athens. Again, the details are a little different, but you can see that kind of light blue area on the far left. That's the executive branch of the government, right? They're in charge of running the day-to-day affairs of the state, right? In orange, you see the judicial part of the state, right? They try crimes, right? The court system. And then in purple, kind of in the middle there, you can see the legislative part of the state, right? The part that passes laws. That's the General Assembly. So again, here in Canada, we've done something quite a bit different. Our system is more complicated by far than ancient Athens, but the kind of basic DNA is still there, right? We're still kind of doing the same things that the Athenians were doing, just in a much more complicated fashion, right? And again, it comes to us from, it comes to us from ancient Greece here, and comes to us from the reforms of, Cleisthenes, okay? So, what I would like to do is, I would like to start watching a little documentary here on democracy in ancient Athens, okay? So I'm just going to I've got some questions for you, as I usually do, and I'm just going to pop them into Microsoft Teams. I'm going to pop them into Microsoft Teams here. And it's an interesting documentary because, number one, it explains kind of how democracy comes to Athens, right? What that process is actually like. But it also kind of, it dispels a bit of the myth around it, because here in the West, there's kind of a very romantic idea of ancient Greece, okay? There's a, because we look back to them and kind of thank them for our democracy, we look back with a very romantic set of lenses, right? And we think that, oh, these Athenians were so advanced, right? And they were so democratic, and they were so thoughtful, right? And sort of noble in a way. And some of that is true, but also some of it is not very true. And so the documentary here does a good job of explaining how democracy came to Athens, but also adding in a little bit of realism, right? In terms of, it's not, Athens wasn't the ideal place that you kind of think of, right? And just because they had a democracy doesn't mean that everyone was an enlightened, noble thinker kind of thing, which I think is tempting to think about. So, as I said, as usual, I've got a few questions for you here. Number one, who was the superpower in the time of classical Athens? Number two, what is the agora? She'll explain what the agora is. Who were the Athenians trading with during this period? Okay. How did democracy come to Athens? What were some of the structures built and tools invented to facilitate democracy in Athens? So if you're going to do democracy, what kind of things do you need to build? Right? How did people become members of the Council of 500? Or how did they become a magistrate or a juror, someone on the jury? Who could and could not vote in Athens? What do we learn about women in Athens? What do orators do, or orators, depending on how you pronounce it? What did the Athenians do with the money from their discovery of silver? Spoiler alert, the Athenians discover a bunch of silver. What is a trireme? And why did the Athenians contact the oracle of Apollo at Delphi? And what answer did they receive? So again, we talked about oracles just the other day. Turns out the Athenians will go to the oracle and ask a question, right? And they will receive an answer. Okay. Good so far? All right. So the link is in the live chat here. It's also in Microsoft Teams. As you can see, I'd like to watch 28 minutes and 45 seconds of it, and then we will discuss the answers to the questions, okay? 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 Felicia, okay? All right. So here we go. So online people, maybe what we'll do is we'll watch to, like I mentioned, 28:45. Then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and talk about this, okay? So we'll see you in just a little bit. Enjoy the documentary. All right, and we are back. So, a little bit about ancient Athens. We get to kind of go there and see some of these ancient Athenian sites, but we hear a little bit of history and a little bit of archaeology and a little bit of all kinds of things, right? So, in this era of classical Athens, who's the main superpower? Who's the biggest, scariest empire out there?
Persia.
Yeah, it's Persia, right? And they show us a map that looks something like this, where the Persians under Darius the First and then under Xerxes a little bit later on are able to expand their control kind of all throughout Central Asia, right? So the Persians are kind of located in the sort of the central part of that empire, but they expand out really almost into India, right? We can see the Hindu Kush there and sort of what's now Punjab, where the Indo-Aryans came in. We can see that the Persians have extended themselves all the way up to the Black Sea there, and then all the way into what's now Turkey, but at the time was called Asia Minor. So they're a huge empire, right, with huge resources and large numbers of soldiers, right? And so, so we heard about the Persians just a little bit early on. We said that they attempted to attack the Greeks in 490 BC. As it turned out, I don't know if you want to hear the story, but the Athenians met with the Greeks, met with Darius, and they had a little bit of a miscommunication. The Athenians were like, oh, we honor you, great Darius. And Darius kind of thought, oh, they're pledging loyalty to me, how nice. But then a few years later, one of the cities that was under the control of Darius, a Greek city, they revolted and the Athenians came and helped them. And so Darius was like, hey, I thought they pledged loyalty to me. Now they're helping out in a revolt against my power. What a bunch of jerks, right? So Darius decides to attack the Athenians. That's when the 300 Spartans kind of defend them, and eventually kind of the Athenians are able to defeat them and send them home. But then they come back, which is what we're hearing about. So yeah, they're kind of the superpower of the day. The Athenians defeat them once, which was kind of a fluke. They kind of got lucky, but they still defeated them. But of course, they'll be back. The Agora. What's the Agora? What's the Agora? Yeah, it's kind of the nice work there, Arya. Yeah, it's the kind of central public area in ancient Greece or in ancient Athens, right? So this is kind of I don't know how you want to think of it, like the center of town, the town square, right in the middle of the city where everybody kind of comes to gather, right? And so for ancient Athens, it kind of looks like, let's see if I have a picture of it here. For ancient Athens, it kind of looked like this. This is kind of, again, an artist's rendition because it's in ruins today. But you can see there's lots of open spaces where people can gather and walk. There's a few big major buildings. There's a theater. There's a temple of Ares. I believe there's some kind of marketplaces and government offices scattered around as well. This is kind of the main town center, right, where everybody comes and hangs out and, meets with people, right? And so our host Bethany there took us through, and they found like huge amounts of archaeological remains from this area, right? People walking around, trading, buying, selling, everyday life in Athens for hundreds and thousands of years. Now, 11. So who were Athenians trading with during this period? Who were they trading with? Sorry, Egypt? Yeah, definitely trading with Egypt. I didn't hear that, I'm sorry. Italy, right? So trading with Italy, which is just to the west of them, trading with Egypt to the south of them. Who else? Let's see here. Yeah, people in northern Africa, right? People in Asia Minor, right? In Phrygia, all the way up around the Caspian Sea, right? So this is, again, we tend to think of some of these ancient groups as kind of isolated, right? But really the Greeks are in contact with everybody during this period, right? All around the Mediterranean, Greek ships are sailing around and trading. Ships from these other parts of the world are trading with Greece. So, the Greeks are kind of well aware of the people around them. They're in contact with them, they're trading with them, maybe they're even friends with them and they go out for beers sometimes, right? They're connected, right? So again, the Greeks are not isolated here, nor are any of these groups, right? They're all kind of connected to each other. Let's see. I'm going to skip over the how did democracy come to Athens because we've kind of covered that and the video explained it as well. But what kind of structures do we hear about in ancient Greece that they used for democracy? Structures or inventions? Physical things that you needed for democracy, whether they were places or inventions. Showed us 1, 2, 3, I would say 3 things. 3 things she showed us. Well, let's look at one of them. One of them was this place called the Pinics, right? She mentions the Pinics a bunch of times, and it's kind of an assembly area, right? And so it's kind of the very earliest version of a legislature, right? Here in Canada, we have the House of Commons in Ottawa, where all of the elected government representatives meet. This is the kind of first version of the House of Parliament or the legislature. This is the Pinics, right? And again, it's kind of ruined now. It just kind of looks like a field sort of thing with some stone. But at the time, it was kind of a stage, right? So the Pinics would have a stage, and then it would have a big open area for people to sit in, right? And that one historian was saying that he suspects there's room for about 6,000 people to sit, right? And that's kind of the amount of people that they would use to vote on things, right? You couldn't vote on things by only having like 10 people there. That's not fair, right? You have to have, actually it's what we call quorum nowadays. You have to have enough people there for the vote to actually be meaningful. So for the Athenians, they wanted 6,000 people there for the vote to kind of count, right? And on stage, they would have orators, right? People who would stand up there and say, I'm in favor of doing this. Actually, they were talking about spending money on silver, or not spending money on silver, spending the money that they had from the silver they discovered, right? I think we should spend the money this way, and here's why. And they would tell the assembly why they thought we should spend the money this way. And then someone else might get up and say, well, I disagree. I think the money should be spent in this fashion. And here's why I think so. And people would get up and give speeches, right? And then eventually you go to a vote, and people are either persuaded one way or another, or they're not. And you have a decision that's made, right? Kind of simple, but also kind of revolutionary for the time, right? Nobody had ever kind of ruled themselves in an ancient civilization. It had always been a king or a pharaoh, or it had been a group of aristocrats or nobles, right? You didn't give power to the people, right? To the masses, to the regular unwashed. You don't give power to them, but here in Athens, they did, right? And so they were kind of going about things in this way, right? Here's another invention that we saw. Pretty simple, but also a little bit ingenious, right? The ballot box for voting. And how do these little discs work? You just throw in the disc, but each person has 2 discs, and they're different. How are they different? How are they different? Yeah. So one is kind of a yes vote or a no vote, or a guilty or not guilty, right? And the difference is the end, right? So it's a round thing with a little axle, and the axle's one side has a little depression in it, and the other side it's smooth, or the other one is smooth, right? And so that way you can walk up to the ballot box, nobody can see how you're voting. You toss it in, you only toss in one, right? You're only allowed one vote, and that way nobody can see how you voted. And then they can count them up at the end and figure out if it's yes or no, guilty or not guilty, right? Pretty clever, right? Anonymous voting. And then she showed us one of these, right? This is a claritarion. This is the coolest thing I've ever seen, right? Very simple. How's it work? Yeah, everybody's got a little name tag on metal. You stick it into the little slot, and then what? Yeah, so there's a bunch of black and white marbles, right? Say we need, 30 jurors for a trial, right? You put 30 white marbles in with a bunch of black ones, mix them up, pour them into the top, and they fall down that little chute right on the far left side. And if your name lines up with a white marble, you get chosen, right? Totally random, impossible to manipulate, right? You don't know where the marbles are going to go. You just put your name in and see if it comes up, right? And really important for ancient Athens too, because you don't want people to be bribing juries, right? Hey, I'm accused of committing a crime, but if you say I'm not guilty, I'll give you $500, right? You don't want people doing that. That's not good for democracy, right? So you select the juries randomly, and you select them on the day, right? So by the time the trial starts and the jury is picked, you don't even know who's going to be on the jury until then. And then it's too late, right? It's too late for you to bribe anyone. And so it's impartial, right? And totally random. Yeah, super smart. Let's see, what else did I ask you here? Oh, well, I guess the answer to question 6 is kind of very similar to what we just talked about, right? The idea that if you were going to be on the Council of 500, or if you're going to be a magistrate or a juror, it would be by random selection, right? So you didn't have to run for office, right? Like we just had the CCSA elections here last week, right? But you didn't have to run for office. They just chose random names. Can you imagine if we did that here in Canada today? I could be the Prime Minister next year, right? They could just randomly pull a name out and say, "Yeah, Mike, you're now the prime minister." That'd be wild, wouldn't it? What's that? I think I'd make a good prime minister. Don't you think so? I mean, I know my hair isn't as nice as Justin Trudeau's, but I mean, but that job is about more than hair, isn't it? It shows your personality. Yeah, but what if you don't have any? No personality? Okay, class is over. Goodbye. Yeah, so they randomly chose, right? So government officials, jurors, members of the Council of 500, all of those are just randomly chosen every year, right? Who could not vote in ancient Athens? Could not. Who? Women, yeah. And we hear some pretty interesting things about how they thought about women and how they treated them. What did we learn? Right? They kind of thought of their place in society as to kind of serve men or to assist men, yeah. What else did we learn? They what? Yeah, the women in Athens were encouraged to cover themselves, right? Especially their faces, right? They were supposed to, when they went out shopping, they had to cover themselves, and they had to have a male escort, right? If not their husband, then maybe an uncle or somebody else in their family, right? So kind of a pretty big inequality between men and women, and this sort of covering of women's faces is not something we usually associate with democracy, right? And Athens and freedom, because again, that freedom and democracy was very much the case for men, but really not so much the case for women, right? What else did we learn about women or how the Greeks thought of them? Didn't they say at one point that they were possessed by demons? Demones? Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. So they were supposed to cover themselves, cover their faces in public. Really, it was only their husbands they would reveal themselves to or reveal themselves for, right? Which again is, I think, is very interesting, considering that we might be tempted to think of Athens as a democracy, as a really free society, but it really wasn't that free, right? Especially for women. And interestingly, if you went to Sparta, and Sparta was a much less well, no, actually, they were much less democratic, right? They were much more authoritarian. But actually, women in Sparta were much more free. They had a lot more freedom. They didn't have to cover themselves. They were free to go out and exercise, and they learned to read. And so women in Sparta actually had a lot more freedom, despite Sparta not being really democratic at all, right? So again, it's really interesting how, two Greek city-states that are not really that far apart could be just totally different worlds to live in, right? Yeah, so we talked about orators, right? People who got up and spoke to the assembly in favor or in opposition of a question, right, before the vote, trying to persuade people to agree with them. Oh yeah, so Athenians found a huge a huge mine of silver in their territory. They mined that silver, and then what did they do with it? Yeah, but they sold it, right? But what did they do with the money? Well, that kind of comes a bit later, but it's connected to that. Yes. What is it? What do they spend their money on? I'll give you a hint. I'll give you a hint. Yeah, these are triremes, they call them, right? And so Athens builds a fleet of these triremes, right? What's that? Yeah, he says, so Barry Strauss, I think, is the academic there. Yeah, he says it's kind of it's almost a symbol of Athenian democracy. Why did he say that? Because it's perfect? It's a it's a well-designed ship, right? It's hard to tell this from, well, actually they don't show it to us in the documentary, but this is a warship, okay? So this is not for trading. There's no cargo holds for olive oil or anything. This thing is a weapon, okay? And it looks a little bit, with the little eye on the front, it looks a little cartoony kind of thing, but make no mistake, this is a weapon, okay? You've got 3 rows of oarsmen on either side, okay? So you've got, I don't know, let's say 200 people rowing. That's a lot of power, right? The trireme is very narrow, okay? It sits very high on the water, right? So there's not a lot of it below the surface. It floats really high. And it's got sails as well. So it's super fast, especially if you have the wind with you. So if you have the wind and you have 150 guys rowing, this thing is like a missile, right? It's like a torpedo. And on the front, you can see there's that little thing in the water. That's made of metal, right? That's a big bronze battering ram. And so what you do is you find a ship that's broadside to you, and then you row as fast as you can, and you basically drive it right into the side of the other ship. And then you quickly back up. The water rushes into the other ship, and they sink. So this thing is a missile, right? It's a bullet, and it can move really, really fast, and it's deadly. And you just go around sinking enemy ships, right? Which the Athenians are able to do pretty well, right? So these are built by the Athenians. It's Themistocles, their general, that gets up and says, "Look, we just won the lottery. We have a lot of silver money now. There's a lot of fun things we can do with it, but we really need to protect ourselves, and this is what we need to spend our money on." And they vote, and fortunately for them, they agree with Themistocles, and they build these things because, as I mentioned before, the Persians are coming back, right? And so they tried once to invade Greece and to invade Athens. The Spartans and the Athenians kind of pushed them back. But now the son of Darius, Xerxes, is coming back, and he's going to take revenge for the defeat of his father, right? And so the Athenians are going to have to be ready, and they have their fleet of ships, right? When they heard the Persians were on the march and coming toward Greece, they went to the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, right? What did the oracle tell them? What did the oracle say in classic oracle fashion. She said, Zeus grants to thrice-born Athena a wooden wall. Only in this shall she be safe. Right? Yeah, and then they argued, right? Yeah, because what does it mean? That's always the problem with oracles. They never give you a straight answer. They're always poetic and vague, right? And so, yeah, what's the wooden wall, right? Is it the wall? Well, that's what Themistocles thought, right? Some people thought, no, it's on the Acropolis. We'll go up there and hide behind the walls. And Themistocles agreed with Felicia, and he was like, no, that's the wooden wall, right? It's our ships. That's how we're going to defeat the Persians, right? So this is where we'll get to next here, but the Athenians, so their plan is this. They abandon Athens. Everybody leaves and goes off into the countryside to hide. The entire city is left empty, okay? And of course, the Persians come upon Athens. It's empty, and they basically burn it to the ground, which I'm sure was awful. The Athenians could see the smoke rising from where they were hiding out. I'm sure it was awful to think that they had abandoned their city. The Persians destroyed it, and they hadn't even fought yet. They hadn't even won yet, and the Persians destroyed Athens. But that's where we get to the second part of our story. So let's just watch that. We've got about 10 minutes, but let's see if we can get an end to that story anyway, because the Persians are on the march here. So online people will go back to the documentary. We'll watch 10 more minutes, and then maybe this sort of Persian invasion story will come to an end anyway. So yeah, let's do that. Let's do that. So 10 more minutes of the documentary. Okay, very interesting, but of course that's all the time we have. So I will let you pack it up. I'll see you tomorrow. And boy, we're really getting close to the end, hey? Yeah. Yep. Okay, that's all for today. Pack it up. See you tomorrow. Have a nice afternoon.